So this is the second message of our new sermon series called Devoted to the End. Deepening intimacy with Jesus at his table. You know that John 13 to 16 comprehends the last night that Jesus had with his disciples. The following day, Jesus would be crucified. And Jesus is there in that place called Upper Room in Jerusalem. Only Jesus and his 12 disciples. Last week, we talked that Jesus, we talked about, it's that? It's on? Oh, it came back. So, Jesus washed his disciples' feet and gave them a great lesson, not only of humility, but also service. So we can say that the title for the first message was Serve to the End. And now, today, the second message we can call Love to the End. Because Jesus brings in here a new commandment. You know, this is a very known passage. And Jesus says, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. So let's talk a little bit about this. Of course, our text brings many important information. We don't have time in 30 minutes to go through every single verse, but I'd like to highlight maybe the main lesson that we have in this passage today. There is a context, and this context is very important to understand the new commandment that Jesus brings in here. The context is a context of a warning. The text that Tim just read for us, says that Jesus was troubled in his spirit and testified, truly, truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me. Think about that. I would say that reading John 13, we could say that this chapter is the chapter of embarrassment. Because last Sunday, we saw that Jesus embarrassed his disciples by something that he did. He washed their feet. But now there is a new kind of embarrassment. Not by something that Jesus did, but for something that Jesus spoke. There is something here that brought embarrassment to them. Imagine that after 3 years, you are there having a meal with your disciples. It was almost a family. And Jesus comes and says, hey, one of you is a traitor. One of you will betray me. And what is interesting here is that Jesus didn't say directly, hey, Judas, you are the traitor. No, Jesus is a kind of vague. He says, one of you, without saying who. And it's interesting here, verse 22 says that the disciples looked at one another, uncertain of whom he spoke. There was a kind of embarrassment, and they were looking at each other and say, I don't understand what Jesus is saying. It's not me. Who is this? So I have a question in here. Why didn't Jesus directly reveal the traitor's identity? He could point directly to Judas, right? And say, Judas, get out of here immediately. He could say that. But Jesus just says, hey, one of you will betray me. And the reason is, I believe that Jesus is encouraging them, giving them an opportunity for a self-assessment. Jesus is bringing the opportunity for each one of them to think about their relationship with Jesus and answer that question, am I a true disciple? And it's important for each one to do that, because our natural tendency is to see a traitor in the other people, not us. We can say hell is other people, not us. It's interesting that Peter has that reaction. Peter is there, and Peter is like anxious with that revelation. It's important to understand that the Last Supper, the classic painting that you know from Da Vinci, it's not a very precise painting about the Last Supper, because probably they were not in a table like lined like a board of directors. No, they were maybe on the floor, and they were reclined that way, right? Eating there. And what we see here is that John, the beloved disciple, was right beside Jesus. Imagine, here is John, Jesus is here, right beside him. And Peter probably is on the other side, the opposite side. And Peter, the text says that he motioned to him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking. You can imagine the picture in here, right? Peter, the other side of the circle, he's saying, talk. It's like that, right? This is what the text is saying. Peter, without saying anything, motioned to John to ask Jesus, hey, Jesus. And John does that. But Jesus just is, we can say, is a kind of enigma. Jesus is enigmatic in here. Jesus said, hey, it is the one that I will give the morsel of bread. We don't know if Jesus did this, if Jesus gave the bread to all of them. But in fact, they didn't realize the identity of the traitor. It's very clear. You see on verse 28, now no one at the table knew why he said this to him. So they were not aware about who was. So there is in here an encouragement, a challenge for a self-assessment. And this is evident when at the end of the dialogue, Simon Peter is saying, hey, I will die for you, Jesus. And Jesus will say, Peter, you don't know what you are talking about. You need to be humble, Peter. You are self-confident, and this is a very dangerous thing. It's interesting that our society says all the time, trust yourself. But what Jesus is saying here basically is one of you What Jesus is saying is that, hey, don't trust yourself. You need to trust me, not yourself, because you are weak. You cannot keep your word to the end. So you need me. No, Peter, it's not you that will die for me. I will die for you. You are not your own Savior. You cannot save anyone. I will save you. So there is a self-assessment challenge in here. There is a question, am I a true disciple? How can I know that? How can I be sure that I am a true disciple? And there is something interesting in the text, because on verse 18, Jesus says, I know whom I have chosen. So Jesus knows who are the true disciples. But then, on verse 35, in the sequence of the new commandment, Jesus says, by this all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. So Jesus says, hey, I know who the true disciples are. But the world, people, and yourselves, you know by this. So Jesus is talking here about what Francis Schaeffer called the mark of the Christian. There is a mark. We can say that loving one another is the distinctive mark of a true disciple. One thing is for you to say something, I am a Christian. Another thing is for you to present to the world the true mark of a disciple. So loving one another is the distinctive mark of a true disciple. So the disciples would know, hey, am I a true disciple? Jesus is saying, hey, you can know. Because there is a mark. And the mark is that you should love one another. So, love to the end means something. Based on the context of that passage, I would say just two things to you today. Jesus will say, love even and love as. Let me explain that. First, love even when you are disappointed. Because the context in here, the context of this passage, of this new commandment, is the context of betrayal. What Jesus is saying here, hey, I am preparing you for your mission in the world. And let me say something. People will betray you. People will attack you. People will disappoint you. But your calling and your commandment to love doesn't depend on other people. It's important for you to understand that this is a commandment. It's not an advice. It's not a suggestion. It's not a statement. It's a commandment. And you can think, well, it's difficult to love when we are betrayed. It's difficult to love when we are disappointed. There is this famous saying, to live with the saints in heaven is a bliss and glory. But to live with saints on earth, oh, this is another story, right? Some people say that because it's difficult to love when we are disappointed. Those times we need to remember that love is a commandment. It's something that we can develop. It's something that we can learn. It's something that we must practice to learn. There is a notion in our days that love is a natural and spontaneous emotion and feeling. We cannot control love. Or the notion that if something is like a commandment, it cannot be love because love is spontaneous. But Jesus is talking here not about a superficial feeling or a human reaction towards another person. No, Jesus is talking here about something deep. John Stott says this type of love is a slave to the will, not a victim of emotion. So you need to train yourself to love like Jesus. So Jesus is saying, hey, regardless what other people will say or will do, you should love. It's something interesting. When we are disappointed, we become skeptics. Imagine that a woman that was betrayed by her husband will go on saying, I don't believe in men anymore. Man is trash. Because she was betrayed. And we can talk this about many other things. If you had a disappointment at the church, you can say, oh, no church, every church is trash because I was disappointed. I was betrayed. So when we are betrayed, we have the natural feeling, reaction to quit. But there is something here that it's not Jesus that quit, it's Judas. Verse 30 says, after receiving the morsel of bread, Judas immediately went out. Jesus stayed, and the traitor, went out. So if you are disappointed, remember that we can stay, we can remain, we can keep the commandment of Jesus, this new commandment. Love even when we are disappointed. And the second lesson is that we should love as Jesus has loved us. And this is why Jesus says that this is a new commandment. Let me explain that. We could ask, why did Jesus call loving one another a new commandment? Because this is not new in the Bible. When you go to Leviticus 19:18, the Bible says, you shall not take vengeance or bear grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So you could ask, why is Jesus saying, I have a new commandment? If the commandment to love one another was very old. Just for information, you know that the Bible was written, the New Testament was written in Greek, not in English. And in Greek, you have two different words to describe or to talk about something new. You have the word neos and the word kainos. They are different words, but they both are translated by new. What's the difference? The difference is that, for example, if you say the house is new, or the house is neos, you are saying, okay, I have a house, this is a house, it's a brand new house. I am the first one to live there. New, brand new house, neos. But if you are in a house and you say, okay, the house is new, but the house could be like 40 years old. But if the house was totally renovated, you can say the house is new because the house was renovated. It's not new if you think about time, but it's new when you think about the quality. There is a new characteristic of this house. The house was renovated. So when Jesus says, a new commandment I give to you, he is using the word kainos, not the word neos. The commandment was not new in terms of time, but it was new in terms of quality. It was a more profound commandment because of the word as. Notice that in Leviticus, the text says, love your neighbor as yourself. But now Jesus is saying, just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. So the old commandment, we can say, is love as yourself. And the new is as Jesus has loved you. And there is a big difference. You can understand the difference? The first case, you are the standard. I love other people, but of course, I need to preserve myself. I need to love myself first. And it's a very popular thing to say that, hey, love yourself. It's a very popular thing to say to love the other, you need to love yourself first. It's popular, but it's heresy. Because the New Testament doesn't say that. The text says we should love not based on my standard, but on Jesus' standard. Love as Jesus has loved us. And the question here is, how did Jesus love us? Not how did the other person treat us, not what did the other person do, but what Jesus did for us. This is the question. How did Jesus love us? And we can use 3 words in here for you to understand very clear what Jesus is saying. So, it means that we should love actively or practically, we should love graciously, and we should love sacrificially, because this is the way that Jesus loved us. So, actively or practically, because Jesus is talking not about words, but about deeds. 1 John chapter 4, verse 9 says, in this the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. The way that God loved us was not to write in the clouds, earth, I love you. The way that Jesus loved us was to commit himself and sent his Son to suffer among us. It was a very concrete thing. In 1 John chapter 3, verse 17 and 18 says, but if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? And he says, little children, let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth. And let me say something. We as Christians, we are very good in talking. We like to talk. We like to say things. We like to, discuss theology. But what Jesus is saying here is something very, very practical. I'm not saying that theology is not relevant or important. On the contrary, we need to understand the Bible so we can live out the Bible. But we need to practice the Word. We need to practice love. And this is what Jesus is saying. It's very practical. This is maybe the way that Jesus is saying here, hey, Peter, you were saying you will die for me. But I know, Peter, these are words. And at the end, what counts is not your words, but your actions, how you will act there. So we should love like Jesus in a practical way. We should love like Jesus in a gracious way. We read in the beginning of the service today, Romans chapter 5. And Romans chapter 5, verse 8 says that God shows His love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So this is grace. Jesus didn't love us because we deserved that. We should not love others because they deserve that. We show them grace because we were, how can I say that in the passive word, but we were the goal of God's grace. God was merciful on us, so we should be merciful on others. And the third word, sacrificially. John 15:13 says, greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. Sacrificially, we are called to make sacrifices, but not in order to achieve grace or to achieve acceptance or to achieve salvation. But we are called to make sacrifices as an expression of God's sacrifice for us. So love even and love as. And Jesus will say, when we love that way, the world will see that you are a true believer. This is the mark. So you don't need to be embarrassed by that. This is what Jesus is saying here. I know that when I said there is a traitor here, this brought embarrassment. But this is for you to make a self-assessment. And this is the calling for the text. I'd like to finish with two quotes that I think are very relevant for us here. The first one is from the 2nd century. A Christian leader called Tertullian, he said, it is mainly the deeds of a love so noble that lead many to put a brand upon us. See how they love one another, they say. For they, and he's talking to the pagans are animated by mutual hatred. How, they say, how they are ready even to die for one another, they say. For they themselves will sooner put to death. So Tertullian was talking about the early Christians and how they suffered in a world full of persecution. But they kept the new commandment. And they said, we need to love one another. We need to cover one another. We need to show mercy on one another. So when one of us is attacked, instead of attacking the aggressor, we protect our brother and our sister, because they loved each other. The second quote comes from the book that I mentioned before, The Mark of a Christian, Francis Schaeffer. He says in John 13, the point was that if an individual Christian does not show love toward other true Christians, the world has a right to judge that he or she is not a Christian. This is very strong. Here, Jesus is stating something else that is much more cutting and much more profound. We cannot expect the world to believe that the Father sent the Son, that Jesus' claims are true, and that Christianity is true, unless the world sees some reality of the oneness of true Christians. This is what Francis Schaeffer will call final apologetic. Loving each other is the final apologetic. We can preach, we can bring information, we can talk, we can discuss, but at the end, if we don't love each other, our message is void. We need to incarnate the message, caring for each other. And I dream with a church that really cares about each other. And I believe that we are walking in that direction. When, for example, we have this program in our church. You know, our church, we have many babies. Almost every month, there is a baby coming. And there is a program in our church coordinated by Tamara, our missions ministry leader, where if you are a mom and you have a baby, during the first 30 days, every day, someone from our church will bring to your house and will give you a meal. Every day. Do you know what's this? Love. This is loving each other. Do we have here examples of that? Did you receive that? If you are a mom here, we have lots here of examples. I'm not lying to you. So this is love. This is the final apologetic to the world. When we love each other that way, do you know what happens? God is glorified. I didn't talk about that, but verse 31, and I'd like to finish with that. I have 2 minutes. When Judas had gone out, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him." Jesus glorified the Father by dying at the cross. The cross was not a defeat. The cross was a victory. The cross was the supreme manifestation of Jesus' love for us. So when we love each other in the same way that Jesus loved us, God is glorified. God shows up to the world. John will say in the first letter, nobody can see God. But when you love each other, you make God visible to the world. God is invisible. But when we love each other, God becomes visible. And this is the calling here. Let's love each other. Let's love to the end. So we can say that the lessons of John 13 are, number 1, serve like Jesus. Serve to the end. Wash one another's feet. And second, love like Jesus. It's interesting that the sign that Jesus gave to his disciples was the bread, right? Jesus said, "It is he to whom I'll give this morsel of bread when I have dipped it." And you know, we cannot be dogmatic in here by saying that this was the Last Supper, that moment. We cannot say that. But in the New Testament, every time that Jesus gives bread, it means something. And we can say that Jesus showed his love for Judas, saying, "Judas, I'm giving you my life. I'm giving you my body, and you betray me. But the fact that you betray me doesn't mean that I won't love you. I will love you to the end. If you live, you live. But know that I love you." By the way, when Judas comes to betray Jesus with a kiss, later this night, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus will call Judas, "Friend, you?" Jesus calls Judas a friend. So there is a great lesson in here for us. You are called today by Jesus himself for this self-assessment. One of you will betray me. Am I a true Christian? This is the question. Are you a true Christian? I'm not talking about what you say. I'm talking about your acts of love.